Everyone at the gala saw what happened by the pool. Only 3 of us knew it was the beginning of a war. The gin slipped from my fingers, and I caught it before it hit the marble, before anyone noticed, before Gideon could add clumsy to the list of things he whispered about me to his colleagues. My wrist ached from the weight of my own performance. 3 hours in 4-inch heels. 3 hours of smiling at men whose names I'd been briefed on in the car, whose hands I'd shaken, whose wives I'd complimented on gowns I'd seen in my own closet. 3 hours of being Gideon Hayes's most polished asset. Around me, the estate blazed with the kind of money that doesn't announce itself, it simply is. The pool stretched black and glassy beneath the night sky, lit from below like something predatory. Silk gowns. Cigarette smoke cut with gardenia. Champagne flutes catching light like little fires. And Gideon, my husband, my architect, my warden, stood with his back to me. Again. Still. Laughing at something a silver-haired man had said, his hand easy on the man's shoulder, his eyes tracking every face in the room except mine. He hadn't looked at me once. I was invisible. Which was almost funny because I was the most expensive thing he owned. That was when I stopped being careful. He stood apart from the crowd near the far edge of the terrace, a man who needed no introduction because his reputation preceded him into every room like a cold front. Zev Valerius. Dark suit, darker eyes, the kind of stillness that belongs to things that don't need to move to be dangerous. I could see the ink at his collar from across the pool. I could feel the radius of him, the way the crowd subtly, unconsciously, gave him space. Gideon feared him. He told me so once, in that clipped, reluctant way he admitted anything that threatened his sense of superiority. That man has no ceiling and no conscience, Lux. Stay away from him. I picked up a fresh glass. I walked straight toward Zev Valerius. My heart was loud in my ears by the time I entered his orbit. He didn't turn. He didn't have to. I had the distinct, skin-prickling sensation that he'd been watching me long before I'd decided to move. Up close, he was worse. Broader. Quieter. The kind of quiet that isn't peace, it's compression. I leaned in close enough that my lips nearly grazed his jaw. Behind me, across the pool, I finally felt it, Gideon's gaze snapping onto me like a trap. Good. The water is black and deep, Mr. Valerius, I breathed, my pulse a wild, reckless thing. Come swim with me. I expected to wound my husband. I didn't expect the hand that closed around my waist like a decision that had already been made. I didn't expect the voice, low and unhurried, that curled into my ear like smoke. Careful, little bird. I don't let my prizes go back to their cages. The gin was still cold in my hand. Gideon had finally gone still across the water, his face a mask with something cracking underneath it. And Zev Valerius had not let go. The morning began with silence. Not the comfortable kind, the engineered kind. The silence Gideon produced the way he produced everything, through deliberate and precise construction. He was already dressed when I woke, which meant he'd risen early, which meant he'd needed the extra hours to build himself back into the version of Gideon Hayes that the world received. I lay still for a moment and listened to him moving through the bathroom with his controlled, economical sounds, water, cabinet, the specific click of his cufflink case, and stared at the ceiling and understood that we had arrived, overnight, in new territory. Not a fight. Gideon didn't fight. Fighting required a willingness to be seen losing, however briefly, and that was a vulnerability he'd excised from himself so long ago I suspected he no longer remembered performing the surgery. What we'd arrived in was a renegotiation of terms. Unspoken, unannounced, but structurally present, the way weather is present before it arrives. He came out of the bathroom in his charcoal suit, the one he wore for hearings he expected to win, and stood briefly at the foot of the bed and looked at me the way he looked at exhibits, cataloging, assessing, deciding on their utility to the larger argument. "You're awake," he said. "I am." He picked up his watch from the dresser, fastened it without looking down, a muscle memory precision that had always impressed me, early on, before I understood that everything about Gideon was a kind of practiced performance of competence. We'll need to address last night. I assumed we would. Not now. He checked the watch face. I have a 7:30. He moved toward the door, paused with his hand on the frame, that particular pause of his, the one I'd come to recognize as the place where he decided what parting shot served the morning's purpose. Wear something appropriate today. The Aldermans are coming for dinner. He left before I could respond, which was also deliberate. The last word, always the last word, not because he was petty, but because he understood that narrative control began with controlling the final sentence of every scene. I heard the front door close. Then the car. Then nothing. The tabloid was on my phone by 8:45. A gossip column, mid-tier, the kind that survived on the social effluent of Miami's moneyed circles, blurry photographs, breathless syntax, the practiced insinuation of people who understood that implication was legally safer than statement. The headline was not subtle. Hayes' wife in close encounter with notorious Valerius at private gala. Below it, a photograph taken on someone's phone, grainy, slightly overexposed, but unmistakable. Zev's hand at my waist. My lips near his jaw. The pool lit blue-black behind us, Gideon a blurred, frozen figure across the water. I looked at it for a long time. It was worse than I'd expected and more honest than I'd intended. The photograph didn't look like a woman making a calculated play for her husband's attention. It looked like a woman who had decided something. My phone began its secondary performance, 3 texts from women in our social circle within the same 20-minute window, each framed as concern, each engineered to extract confirmation of whatever story they were already constructing. I read them without responding. Then I put my phone face down on the bed and sat in the silence of the house and breathed. Gideon would have seen it already. His assistant monitored these columns as a professional courtesy. Image management was a feature of the life he'd built, and the life he'd built included me as a component of that image. He would have read it between his 7:30 and whatever followed, in the back of his car or in the elevator of his firm's building, and he would have processed it with the same contained efficiency with which he processed all information that required management. He hadn't called. That was the tell. A man who loved his wife would have called. A man who feared losing something irreplaceable would have called. The silence of Gideon's phone confirmed, without ambiguity, what I'd been assembling for years in the cautious, reluctant way of a person who doesn't want to finish the picture because they can see what it's going to be. I was not irreplaceable. I was inconvenient. The Aldermans came at 7. Richard and Sylvia, his client and his client's wife. Richard, a developer with the handshake of a man who'd built his confidence on other people's land. Sylvia, a woman of practiced warmth whose eyes calculated everything they touched. I wore the navy dress Gideon liked because I was still, on that particular evening, choosing my battles, and the Alderman dinner was not the battle I was choosing. Gideon was present in the way he was present when it mattered, attentive, warm in his managed way, the perfect portrait of a man at ease in his own home. He touched my arm twice at the table, both times at angles visible to our guests. He refilled my wine before I asked. He said my wife with the particular possessive warmth that people who didn't know him well heard as affection. Sylvia Alderman touched my hand over dessert and said, "You two are just lovely together," with the sincerity of a woman who genuinely meant it and had no instruments for detecting what moved beneath the surface of lovely. I smiled. "Thank you," I said. "We are." After they left, after the door closed and the house contracted back to its 2-person silence, Gideon carried his glass to the kitchen and rinsed it and set it in the rack with his back to me and said, without turning, "Good. Tonight was good. Not thank you. Not you were wonderful. Good. An assessment. A performance review delivered to a sink." I stood in the kitchen doorway in my navy dress and felt the specific, clarifying anger of a woman who has just been graded and found satisfactory, and thought about a photograph on a gossip column and a hand at my waist. and 4 words written in velvet that I hadn't yet received, but was, I understood now, already waiting for. "I know," I said. I went upstairs. The navy dress went back on its hanger, because I was still, in those days, taking care of his things. But I sat on the edge of the bed for a long time after, in the dark and the quiet, and I did not perform sleep. I simply waited. For what, I couldn't have said precisely. Only that something had shifted in the night air, and the house knew it, and I knew it, and somewhere across the city, I suspected, so did he. The morning after the gala, Gideon didn't touch his coffee. That was how I knew. He always touched his coffee first thing, both hands wrapped around the mug like it was the only warm thing in the house he permitted himself. But that morning he stood at the kitchen island in his shirt and trousers, jacket not yet on, and the mug sat steaming and untouched beside him while he watched me walk in. I'd slept badly. Or rather, I hadn't slept at all. I'd lain in the dark on my side of our California king and stared at the ceiling and listened to Gideon breathe with the controlled evenness of a man performing sleep. We were both pretending. We'd been pretending for years. Last night was simply the first time I'd let someone else see it. I went to the refrigerator. I wasn't hungry. I opened it anyway. "You made a spectacle of yourself." His voice was the temperature of the room, controlled, climate-adjusted, designed to keep everything inside it perfectly preserved. Not hot. Never hot. Gideon didn't do hot. Did I? It wasn't a question. You know who he is. I took out the orange juice. Poured a glass I wouldn't drink. Everyone knows who he is. The silence that followed was the kind Gideon deployed like a legal instrument, letting it sit there, letting it accrue weight, waiting for me to fill it with something he could use. I'd learned that silence in our first year of marriage. I'd spent the next 4 learning not to break it. I didn't break it now. He picked up his jacket from the back of the chair, shrugged it on with the practiced ease of a man who'd armored himself so many times it had become unconscious. "We'll discuss it tonight." He picked up his coffee, finally, took 1 sip, and set it back down. "Don't embarrass me further in the meantime." The door closed behind him with a soft, definitive click. I stood in the kitchen for a long time after that, the orange juice going warm in my hand, the house settling into its daytime silence around me, all high ceilings and cool stone, and the faint mechanical breathing of the air conditioning. A beautiful cage. Gideon had chosen everything in it. The art, the furniture, the temperature. Me. I was rinsing the glass when the doorbell rang. The delivery driver was young, indifferent, already turning back toward his car before I'd fully opened the door. No company branding on his jacket. No van at the curb, just a dark sedan idling at the end of the drive with tinted windows and the engine still running. He'd handed me a matte black box, no larger than my palm, tied with a single ribbon the color of dried blood. No card. I stood in the doorway and looked at it for a moment before I looked back up, but the sedan was already gone. I should have put it down. I should have called Gideon, or thrown it in the trash, or placed it on the hall table and walked away and decided it meant nothing because nothing had actually happened. Because I was Lux Sterling and I was composed and controlled and I did not accept gifts from men like Zev Valerius. I took it inside. I sat on the edge of the bed, my side, the side that always felt like a border rather than a place to rest, and I untied the ribbon slowly, the way you do when some part of you already knows you won't be able to undo whatever's inside. The lid came off smooth and silent. Inside, nested in black velvet, was a bracelet. Not flashy. That was the first thing that struck me. I'd expected flash, the way men like him announced themselves in gold and excess. But this was a single strand of oxidized silver, thin as a thread, with one small charm. A bird in mid-flight, wings spread, caught at the exact moment between rising and falling. Exquisite. The kind of thing made by someone who understood craft rather than cost. I turned it over in my fingers. On the inside of the lid, pressed into the velvet in a way I'd almost missed, was a card no larger than a business card. No name. No number. Just 4 words, written in a hand that was unhurried and precise. You forgot your cage. I set it down on the bedside table. My hands, I noticed, were not steady. I didn't put the bracelet on. I told myself that clearly, firmly, the way you state rules to yourself when you sense they're about to be broken. I put it back in the box. I put the box in the drawer of my nightstand. I closed the drawer and went downstairs and made tea I didn't drink and answered 2 emails I'd been ignoring and called my sister and talked for 20 minutes about nothing, her garden, her youngest school play, a holiday she was planning. And the entire time some quiet, restless part of me was upstairs, sitting beside that drawer. By 3 in the afternoon, I was back in the bedroom. I told myself I was only looking at it again. The charm was even more precise up close in the afternoon light, each feather in the wing rendered individually, the body of the bird caught mid-tilt as if deciding, even now, which way to bank. It was the kind of detail that required patience. The kind of patience that made something feel like a message rather than a gift. You forgot your cage. Not, come back. Not a threat. Not even an invitation. Just an observation, delivered with the absolute confidence of a man who'd already decided how this ended. He wasn't asking me anything. He was simply noting, with that same unnerving stillness I'd felt on the terrace last night, that he knew exactly what I'd left behind, and that he found it interesting. The worst part wasn't the bracelet. The worst part was that he was right. I had forgotten it for exactly 30 seconds in his orbit. The cage, the performance, the mug of untouched coffee, all of it. 30 seconds of pure, stupid, dangerous aliveness. I put the bracelet on. Just to see. Just for a moment, alone in the house, with no one watching, I fastened it around my wrist and held my arm up in the light and looked at that small silver bird and felt something move through my chest that I hadn't felt in so long I'd convinced myself it was gone. Then I heard Gideon's car in the driveway. I took it off. Back in the box. Box in the drawer. I was at my vanity, earrings already in, the perfect picture of a well-composed afternoon, by the time his key turned in the lock downstairs. But my pulse was still loud, and the drawer was still warm. Gideon chose a Tuesday to dismantle me, not a Friday, when the week's exhaustion might have softened his precision. Not a weekend, when the performance of a normal marriage required us to at least occupy the same rooms with something resembling ease. A Tuesday over dinner, with the table set the way it always was, candles, linen napkins, the good plates we used every night because Gideon believed that standards applied regardless of audience. It was one of the things I'd once admired about him. The consistency. I understood now that it wasn't discipline. It was control wearing discipline's clothing. The food was already on the table when he sat down. He unfolded his napkin, laid it across his knee, and said, without looking up from his plate, "I spoke with your father today." I set down my fork. My father. Retired, 63, living in a modest house in Coral Gables on a pension that had never quite recovered from the investment losses of 2019, losses that Gideon had quietly, generously, helped absorb. A fact my father mentioned with grateful regularity. A fact Gideon had never once brought up. Until now. He sounded well, Gideon continued, cutting into his food with the unhurried efficiency of a man performing surgery. We talked about his refinancing situation. The second mortgage. The rate adjustment coming in the spring. A pause. A single bite, chewed and swallowed. He's in a precarious position. Financially. Gideon. My voice came out steadier than I felt. I told him not to worry. He looked up then, and his eyes were exactly as I'd always known them, clear, intelligent, utterly without warmth. Like looking into the lens of a camera. I told him that family takes care of family. Another pause, calibrated to the millimeter. Provided, of course, that family remembers what it owes. The candle between us burned very straight in the still air. I had known, in some theoretical way, that this moment would come. I had known it the way you know a storm is coming when the pressure drops, not the specific hour, not the exact shape of it, but the certainty. Gideon did not absorb humiliation. He processed it, filed it, and returned it at a time and angle of his choosing, with interest. What I hadn't accounted for was how surgical it would feel. He hadn't raised his voice. He hadn't threatened me directly. He'd simply picked up the most fragile thing in my life and held it up to the light so I could see exactly how easily it broke. "My sister," I said. Quietly. "Testing." He smiled. It was the smile he used in depositions, patient, almost kind. "Elena's clinic is up for its annual review with the county licensing board. These things can be complicated. Slow. Especially when there are questions about administrative compliance." He lifted his wine glass. "Or they can be smooth. It depends enormously on who's paying attention." Elena, my younger sister, who'd spent 8 years building a small women's health clinic in Overtown with grant money and stubbornness and 15-hour days. Who called me twice a week. Who still thought Gideon was difficult but decent. Who had no idea. I looked at my husband across the candlelight and understood, with a clarity that felt almost peaceful in its completeness, that I was not looking at a man who had been wounded. I was looking at a man who had simply decided to stop hiding his architecture. "What do you want?" I said. Not a question. A formality. "I want what I have always wanted, Lux." He set his glass down. "A wife who understands her position. A household that functions without incident. An end to whatever this is." He gestured, once, vaguely, a gesture that encompassed the gala, the bracelet, me. "You made a childish, embarrassing choice. I'm willing to set it aside. What I am not willing to do is allow you to continue pulling threads simply because you're bored." Bored. As though 4 years of erasure were a mood. As though I had grown restless with a pleasant life rather than suffocated inside a constructed one. I said nothing. "Valerius is not a man who plays at things, Lux. Whatever you imagined would happen, whatever reaction you were performing for, he is not a game piece. He will not behave like one. And when he doesn't, you will be the one who suffers the consequences. Not him." He picked up his fork again. "I'm trying to protect you." And there it was. The thing that made Gideon Hayes truly dangerous, not the threats, but the sincerity with which he dressed them. He had likely told himself that version on the drive home. Had refined it, believed it, committed to it the way he committed to every argument he intended to win. He was protecting me. He was preserving the household. He was being reasonable. Any woman of sense would understand. I picked up my fork. "All right," I said. He looked up. "All right," I said again, meeting his eyes with the same smooth surface I'd spent 4 years perfecting. "You've made your point." Something in him settled, not softened, never softened, but settled, recalibrating from threat mode to management mode. He gave a small nod, as though approving a revised brief. "Good. Then we don't need to revisit this." We finished dinner in silence. I cleared the plates. He went to his study. The house resumed its climate-controlled hum around me, every object in it perfectly positioned, perfectly chosen, perfectly his. I washed my hands at the kitchen sink and stood for a moment with the water running cold over my wrists. Then I went upstairs. I opened the nightstand drawer. Took out the black box. Took out the bracelet. I didn't put it on this time, I just held it in my palm and looked at that small silver bird, wings open, caught between rising and falling. My father's refinancing. Elena's clinic. The weight of them pressed down on me with a precision that felt almost architectural, because Gideon had built this, had been building it for years, laying foundations I hadn't seen until he chose to show them to me. He thought he'd won tonight. He had, in every measurable way. I'd said all right. I'd cleared the plates. I'd been exactly what he needed me to be. But I sat on the edge of my bed in the quiet of the house and turned the bracelet over in my fingers, and I thought about a man who stood at the edge of parties like he owned the air around him. Who sent gifts with no return address. Who had wrapped a hand around my waist like the decision had already been made before I'd even started walking toward him. Gideon threatened the things I loved to keep me small. It was working. And the part of me that frightened me most, the part that had walked across that terrace, the part that had fastened a bracelet to its wrist in secret, was no longer sure it wanted to stay small. I put the bracelet back in the box. But I didn't put the box back in the drawer. I left it on top of the nightstand, in plain sight, where I could see it when I woke up. I found his number the way you find things you've been pretending not to look for suddenly, as if it had always been there. A contact in Gideon's private directory, buried between a federal judge and a shipping magnate, labeled with no name. Just an initial. V. Gideon kept his enemies closer than his allies. I'd always known that. What I hadn't known, until I stood in his study at 10 in the morning while he was in court, was that Zev Valerius had an entry in that directory at all. That they had, at some point, been close enough to exchange numbers. That the line between Gideon's legal world and Zev's other one was not a wall but a door, and someone had left it unlocked. I wrote the number on the inside of my wrist in ink, the way I used to write exam answers in school when I was 17 and terrified of forgetting. Then I went upstairs, showered it off, and spent 40 minutes convincing myself I wasn't going to use it. Then I used it. He picked up on the second ring, which somehow startled me more than if he hadn't picked up at all. No greeting. Just silence, breathing, present, waiting as though he'd been expecting the call and saw no reason to perform surprise. It was a mistake, I said. I'd rehearsed it. Those 4 words, clean and unambiguous, the way Gideon had taught me to communicate, lead with the conclusion, don't over-explain, give nothing away. The gala. What I said to you. It was impulsive and it was a mistake and I need you to, I stopped. I'd rehearsed the next part too, and it had sounded reasonable in my bathroom mirror. It sounded different now, with his silence on the other end of the line, patient and faintly amused in a way I could feel without hearing. I needed to stop. A pause. Then, unhurried, come say that to my face. I'm saying it now. You're saying it to a phone. Another pause, briefer. There's a difference. You know there's a difference. I should have hung up. I had a list of reasons to hang up: my father's mortgage, Elena's clinic, the dinner table 3 nights ago, the word behave delivered over good china by a man who believed he was being generous. Every reason pointed toward the same instruction: put the phone down, go back downstairs, be what he needs you to be until you figure out another way. I heard myself say, where? He sent an address 20 minutes later. No message attached, just a location pin, a building near the waterfront in a part of the city that existed in the gray space between legitimate and not, the kind of neighborhood that had been almost gentrified for 15 years and remained, stubbornly, itself. I took a cab rather than the car Gideon's firm leased in my name. I wore sunglasses I didn't need. I felt, the entire ride there, like a woman in a film making a choice the audience could already see was irreversible. The building was a converted warehouse, understated in the way that serious money sometimes is. No signage, clean lines, a door that looked ordinary until you noticed the frame was reinforced steel. A man I didn't know opened it before I knocked. Said nothing. Led me through a corridor that smelled of cedar and cold air and up a staircase to a room on the 2nd floor that was, unexpectedly, disarmingly quiet. Zev was standing at the window when I came in. The city behind him, midday light falling flat and white across the floor. He was in a dark shirt, no jacket, sleeves pushed to the elbows, and I saw, properly for the first time, the full geography of the ink on his forearms. Not chaos. Not the performance of danger. Precise, deliberate work, each image bleeding into the next with the coherence of a language I didn't speak but could recognize as language. He looked like himself, was the thing. Completely, uncomplicatedly himself, in a way that Gideon never did, in a way that I wasn't sure I ever had. He turned when he heard me. Didn't smile. Just looked at me with those still, dark eyes and said nothing, which forced me to start. I meant what I said on the phone. I stayed near the door. I had decided, in the cab, to stay near the door. This has gone further than I intended. The bracelet, he tilted his head, fractionally. You need to stop sending things to my house. You need to step back. Whatever you think happened between us at the gala, it was. Sit down, Lux. Nobody called me Lux except Gideon, and when Gideon said it, it sounded like a filing system, a label on a folder. When Zev said it, it sounded like something he'd decided to keep. I'm not staying. I know you're not. He moved away from the window, unhurried, the way he did everything, as though time arranged itself around him rather than the other way. He sat on the edge of the table across the room and crossed his arms and looked at me with the expression of a man hearing a presentation he's already read the conclusion to. Say the rest of it. You came here to say it, so say it. I said it. All of it, Gideon's dinner, the implicit threat, my father, Elena's clinic, the architecture of it all laid out plainly because I was tired of carrying it alone and he was, improbably, the only person I'd stood near in weeks who hadn't felt like part of the structure. When I finished, the room was quiet. Zev looked at me for a long moment. Then he said, he called your sister's licensing board on Monday morning. Filed an anonymous administrative inquiry. Compliance review, 60 to 90 days. He let that settle. He did it before dinner. Before he sat down and told you he was protecting you. The floor felt slightly less solid than it had. How do you? Because I've been watching Gideon Hayes for 2 years. His voice remained level, almost gentle, which was somehow worse than if it had been hard. I know who he pays. I know who pays him. I know about the offshore account he opened in your name without your knowledge, and I know what's in it, and I know that if he decides you've become a liability rather than an asset, that account is the first thing a prosecutor sees. He paused. You came here to end something. I'm telling you there's nothing left to end. You've been in this since before the gala. You just didn't know the game had started. I thought about the bracelet on my nightstand. The bird with its wings open, caught between rising and falling. So, what do you want from me? I said. My voice was very quiet. He looked at me steadily. Right now? Nothing. He stood unhurried. But you should know I didn't accept your invitation because of Gideon. He moved toward the door. Past me, close enough that I felt the warmth of him, the compression of that particular stillness. He opened the door and stood aside. I accepted it because of you. I walked out. The cab ride home was 20 minutes. I spent all of it staring at the city moving past the window, my hands still in my lap, the ink long gone from my wrist, but the number already memorized. He hadn't asked me to stay. He didn't need to. He didn't ask. He informed. A message, Thursday evening, while I was sitting in the bath with a book I hadn't been reading, tonight. 8. Where's something you don't mind losing? No signature. No context. The kind of message that assumed compliance so completely it didn't bother requesting it. I should have put my phone face down and gone back to my unread book. I was dressed by 7:15. I told Gideon I was having dinner with a friend from the museum board, a woman named Petra, who was socially prominent enough to be credible and strategically unavailable enough that he'd never bother verifying. He was on a call in his study when I left, the door half open, and he raised 2 fingers in acknowledgement without turning around. For years of marriage, condensed to a gesture. I closed the front door quietly behind me and stood for a moment on the step in the night air, and felt something in my chest loosen by a single degree, the specific relief of a room you didn't realize was airless until you stepped outside it. The car that came for me was black, unmarked, driven by a man who introduced himself as Marco and then said nothing else for the duration of the ride, which I respected. We drove south, away from the neighborhoods Gideon moved through, into a part of the city that shifted its character block by block, restaurants giving way to warehouses giving way to something waterfront and low-lit that didn't advertise itself at all. Zev was waiting outside when we arrived. No grand entrance. No theater. Just a man standing on a dock in a dark jacket, hands in his pockets, watching the water with the patience of someone who'd learned long ago that the world arranged itself more efficiently when you stopped chasing it. He looked at me when I got out of the car. Looked at the dress, black, simple, the kind of thing that required confidence rather than coverage. Something shifted in his expression, briefly, before settling back into its usual composure. You wore something you don't mind losing, he said. I wore something I chose, I said. There's a difference. He almost smiled. There is. He turned toward the dock. Come on. The boat was not what I expected, which I was beginning to understand was his particular skill, managing expectations downward until the reality arrived and rearranged everything. Not a yacht, not yet, but a sleek, low-slung vessel that moved through the water with a silence that felt expensive in a way that had nothing to do with size. He took the wheel himself. No crew. Just the two of us and the black water and the city falling away behind us in a scatter of lights. He didn't make conversation, and neither did I. It should have been uncomfortable. It wasn't. There was something in his particular quality of silence that was different from Gideon's. Gideon's silence was a tool, always directed, always building toward something. Zev's was simply where he lived. You could exist inside it without being managed by it. We docked at a private marina I didn't recognize, where another car was waiting. This time we drove inland 20 minutes to a building that looked from the outside like a closed restaurant and was, from the inside, something else entirely. It was a restaurant. That part was real. White tablecloths, low lighting, a menu that arrived without prices. But the clientele, I understood within minutes of sitting down, was not the kind of clientele that worried about being seen. They were the kind that had arranged, very carefully, never to be photographed. A man in his 60s at the far table who I recognized from a federal indictment Gideon had mentioned once and then stopped mentioning. A woman in ivory who moved with the ease of someone whose security detail was parked outside. Two men near the bar who laughed at something and briefly revealed, in the movement of a jacket, the outline of things that were not phones. Zev watched me take it in. He poured wine, unhurried. Say it, he said. I haven't said anything. You're cataloging. He set the bottle down. You're sitting there filing everything away, deciding what it means, deciding what it makes me. He looked at me evenly. Say what you're thinking. I'm thinking, I said carefully, that you brought me somewhere you didn't have to bring me. No. You could have taken me somewhere clean. Somewhere impressive, but I searched for the word. Edited. I could have. He picked up his glass. I didn't. I looked at him across the table in the low light and understood that this was, in its way, a form of honesty I hadn't been offered in years. Gideon's world was all edited surfaces, everything curated, everything controlled, the seams hidden so well you forgot there were seams. Zev was showing me the seams deliberately. Not to frighten me. To see what I did with them. The food came and was extraordinary, and we ate and talked about the city, about art, about a book he referenced that surprised me, about the specific architecture of inherited power versus built power, and which one a person trusted more. He was sharper than people likely assumed, which was probably useful. He listened the way very few people listened, not waiting for his turn, but actually tracking, processing, adjusting. It was disarming in a way that a man who led with charm could never be. It was close to 11 when the door at the back of the restaurant opened. Two men came through it, moving with the low urgency of people delivering news that couldn't wait. They went directly to the table by the far wall, the man I'd recognized from the indictment, and the quality of the room shifted in a way I felt before I understood. Like a pressure change. The two men near the bar were no longer laughing. Zev set his glass down. His eyes moved once to the table, then back to me. Stay here, he said quietly. He stood and crossed the room without haste, and I watched him speak to the older man, who listened, and then the expression on the older man's face told me something was very wrong. Zev's face told me nothing, it never did, but his hand went briefly to the other man's shoulder, once, in the way of someone issuing instructions that would be followed without question, and then he turned and spoke to the two men who'd entered. And one of them left immediately through the back door, and then Zev stood still for a moment, and I watched him make a decision before he turned back toward me. He sat back down, poured the last of the wine into my glass. Did someone get hurt? I said. He looked at me steadily. Yes. Is it resolved? It will be. He said it the way you say that a weather system is moving through. Matter of fact. Already passed. I picked up my glass. My hand was steady, which surprised me, or perhaps it didn't, because the part of me that had walked across the terrace toward him already knew what it had been walking toward. Not safety. Not escape. Something more honest than either. The blood beneath the glamour, I said quietly, half to myself. He heard it. You can still leave, Lux. I looked at him across the white tablecloth, in the low light, with the sound of the city pressing faintly against the windows, and somewhere behind us a room full of people who operated outside every rule Gideon Hayes had built his life enforcing. I know, I said. I didn't leave. I came home to all the lights on. Not the soft, automated warmth of the timed fixtures, all of them, every room, blazing with the flat, exposing brightness of a space being searched or a person being waited for. I knew before I put my key in the lock. I knew from the driveway, standing in the dark with the sound of the water somewhere distant and my pulse doing the thing it did now whenever the house stopped feeling like a house and started feeling like what it was. Gideon was in the living room. Seated, not standing, which was worse somehow. Standing would have meant reactive. Seated meant he'd had time to compose, to arrange, to decide exactly what this would look like before I arrived to witness it. His jacket was off. His tie was loosened by exactly 1 inch. On the coffee table in front of him was a manila folder, closed, and a glass of scotch he hadn't touched. He looked at me the way he looked at witnesses he was about to discredit. Petra Halsworth has been in London since Monday, he said. Her assistant confirmed it when I called. I set my bag down on the hall table. I didn't say anything. Sit down, Lux. I sat. Not because he told me to, because I needed to think, and thinking required stillness, and stillness required a chair, and this was the calculation I was making while my heart ran its own separate, louder calculation underneath. He opened the folder. Slid it across the coffee table toward me. Photographs. 8 of them, printed cleanly on plain paper. The dock, the marina, the restaurant entrance. Zev's hand at the small of my back as he held the door. The two of us through the restaurant window, the white tablecloth, the wine, the lean of my body toward his across the table that I hadn't noticed at the time but was captured in still image, unmistakable in its intimacy. Someone had been outside all evening. Someone had been paid to be outside all evening. I looked at the photographs for a long moment. Then I closed the folder. This is what you do, I said. When you feel threatened, you document. I protect my interests. He retrieved the folder with the efficiency of a man reclaiming evidence. What you've been doing is not, he stopped. Reset. Gideon never let emotion dictate syntax. What you've been doing is reckless and it ends now. Not because of us. Because of what Valerius is. You've explained what Valerius is. I don't think I have. He picked up his scotch, finally, and held it without drinking. I have a client. A development group. You've heard me mention the Meridian Project, the waterfront parcels on the South End. 3 years of work. 40 million in pre-investment. He looked at me steadily. Valerius has been quietly acquiring adjacent property for 18 months. Blocking access, complicating zoning, running interference through holding companies that don't exist on paper. He's been dismantling the project from the outside in. A pause precisely waited. Until this week, I didn't know why. I didn't know what he wanted. The room was very quiet. Now I do, Gideon said. I understood then. The full geometry of it, not a line between Gideon and Zev, but a triangle, and I was the third point. I thought about the contact in Gideon's private directory. The initial V. I thought about what Zev had said in the warehouse. I've been watching Gideon Hayes for 2 years. I'd assumed it was the surveillance of a predator. I hadn't considered it might also be the surveillance of a man with a prior account to settle. He used me, I said. Half statement, half test. You walked into his hands. Gideon's voice was not unkind, which was somehow the most cutting version of it. He didn't need to use you. You presented yourself. The photographs sat between us in their closed folder, and I thought about a silver bracelet and a restaurant and a man who'd said, "I didn't accept your invitation because of Gideon," and I turned it over now, in this light, and examined whether I believed it, and found, with a cold clarity that felt like stepping into deep water, that I still did. Which meant it was possible for both things to be true. That Zev wanted the Meridian parcels. And that what had passed between us at the white tablecloth was also real. People were not simple. I had been living with a simple man for 4 years and had forgotten that. "What are you going to do?" I said. Gideon set his glass down. "I filed an emergency motion this afternoon. Federal commercial interference. I have enough documentation to freeze his holding companies pending a full financial audit. It will take 6 months minimum to unwind. The Meridian deal closes before then." He said it with the flat satisfaction of a man describing a completed task. "His legal team will fight it. They're good. But mine are better, and the filing is airtight." I looked at my husband. "And me. You are going to be available," he said, "for a dinner I've arranged for Saturday. The Meridian investors. You'll attend, you'll be present, you'll be exactly what this deal needs you to be while the story in the press is managed." He closed the folder completely. "You'll also be photographed at the Whitmore Gala next week. With me. Together. Whatever the tabloids have been spinning will be corrected by your visible presence at my side. A prop. Still. After everything, still and always a prop deployed, positioned, returned to the shelf." But I kept my face smooth. I had learned, in 4 years, to keep my face smooth. "All right," I said. He looked at me for a moment longer than usual, searching for the seam, the tell, the slight misalignment that meant I was managing him. I gave him nothing. I'd learned that from him, ironically. The perfect surface. The composed reply. "Good," he said. He stood, collected his folder, picked up his scotch, and carried it with him toward the stairs. At the doorway he paused. "The photographs stay with my attorney. That's not a threat, it's information. You should have it." He went upstairs. I sat in the bright, overlit room for a long time after I heard the bedroom door close. The house hummed around me. Every light still blazing, because he hadn't turned them off and I hadn't moved. Then I picked up my phone. I didn't type anything for a long moment, just held it, in the silence, with the weight of everything I now knew pressing down with a precision that was almost architectural. Gideon had filed this afternoon. Which meant Zev didn't know yet. Which meant there was a window hours, maybe, before his legal team was alerted, before the freeze hit, before the whole mechanism that Gideon had built in careful silence came down on the empire Zev had built in careful shadow. I could say nothing. Let it land. Remind myself that Zev had, in some version of the story, used my humiliation as a business instrument. I thought about the restaurant. The way he'd said you can still leave. The way he'd waited, genuinely, to see what I'd do. I typed, he filed today. Federal commercial interference. They're coming for the holding companies. I stared at it. I pressed send. The lights in the room felt, suddenly, very exposing. They took me on a Wednesday, which felt banal in retrospect. Not a dramatic evening, not a charged moment with weather to match, a Wednesday at 11 in the morning, outside the dry cleaner on Biscayne where I'd been going for 3 years. While the city moved around me at its ordinary midweek pace, and a woman with a stroller passed not 30 feet away, and the sun was bright and indifferent overhead. 2 men, professional in the way that frightened me more than aggression, would have no raised voices, no visible weapons in the first 3 seconds. Just a black SUV at the curb and a hand at my elbow that was polite enough to almost be mistaken for assistance, and a voice that said, quietly, "Don't make a scene and you won't be hurt," with the flat conviction of someone delivering a rehearsed line they'd delivered before. I didn't make a scene. I thought about screaming. I ran the calculation in the 3 seconds I had and arrived at the conclusion that the woman with the stroller was too close and the men were too certain, and certainty in men like these meant preparation, which meant the scene I made would only determine what happened to people near me rather than what happened to me. So I got in the SUV with my dry cleaning still over my arm, which struck me later as an absurd detail, and the door closed and the city continued its Wednesday outside the tinted windows as though nothing had shifted. We drove for 40 minutes. I memorized what I could: the direction, the turns, the quality of the light changing as we moved further from the water. They took my phone at the first red light. One of the men held out his hand, and I placed it in his palm, and he put it in his jacket pocket, and that was that. No bag over my head, no restraints, which meant either they weren't worried about me identifying the location or they were worried about something else, and I was not, in their operational calculus, a complicated problem. The building they brought me to was industrial, inland, the kind of place that stored things. I was put in a room on the ground floor that had a window too high to reach and a chair and a folding table and a bottle of water, which told me someone had thought about the minimum requirements of keeping a person functional without comfort. I sat in the chair and put the dry cleaning across the table and breathed. I thought about who knew I was gone. Gideon's driver picked me up at noon on Wednesdays. When I wasn't there, he'd call the house, then Gideon's office. Gideon would be in court until 2. His assistant would get the call first. The machine would take approximately 3 hours to understand that something was wrong, and then it would hand the problem to Gideon, who would assess it the way he assessed everything in terms of cost, exposure, and optimal outcome. I already knew what his assessment would be. A man came in at the 2-hour mark. Not young, not physically imposing, the kind of face you forgot while you were still looking at it. He told me, in the unhurried manner of someone who found this professionally unremarkable, that I was collateral, that a message had been sent to my husband, that the terms were clean and the timeline was short, and that provided Gideon Hayes behaved sensibly, I'd be home by Friday. And if he doesn't behave sensibly, I said. He looked at me with mild, professional regret. Then you become a different kind of message. He left. I sat with the water and the dry cleaning and the late afternoon light moving across the high window, and I thought about the word collateral, how completely it described the role I'd occupied for years before this room. How Gideon had never needed to say it aloud because it was simply structurally true, and how it had taken strangers to make it official. My phone was gone. I had no way to reach anyone. But Zev already knew about the filing. He'd responded to my message one line at midnight when I was already in bed pretending to sleep. Received. Stay close to the house. I hadn't, obviously. It was Wednesday, and I had dry cleaning, and I had spent 4 years refusing to let fear manage my schedule, and I had not connected the instruction to a specific, imminent threat because I was still, in some fundamental way, learning the grammar of the world I'd walked into. Stay close to the house. I closed my eyes. Opened them. The light in the window had gone from afternoon white to the flat gray of early evening. Gideon had been called. Somewhere on the other end of a phone, my husband was performing the calculation. I knew the variables he'd weigh, the optics of paying, the optics of not, the legal exposure of involving police, the financial exposure of the ransom figure, whatever it was. I knew, with the same cold clarity that had been arriving in increments since the dinner table with the untouched coffee, that I was one variable among several. Not the heaviest one. The man came back at 9. His expression had shifted by a degree, not softer, but recalibrated. Your husband's attorney communicated that Mr. Hayes considers this a matter for law enforcement, he said. He paused to let that land. He will not be negotiating. I looked at him steadily. I see. This complicates your situation. Yes, I said. I imagine it does. He left again. I heard the quality of the building change around me, more movement, voices at a register too low to parse, the specific energy of a plan being revised. They hadn't expected Gideon to refuse. Most people, I gathered, did not refuse. Most people understood that the message being sent required a response, that the system only functioned when both sides observed its grammar. Gideon had declined to participate in the grammar, which meant I had become, in the span of a phone call, a liability rather than a leverage point. I was still working through the implications of this when I heard it. Not an alarm, nothing so legible. More like the building's sound changed at a register below hearing, a shift in air pressure, a sudden absence where there had been ambient noise. Then, distantly, a door. Then another sound, sharp, brief, architectural, the kind that rearranged the structure it came from. Then shouting, close and then closer, and then a second sound that was louder and final, and then nothing, and then footsteps, and then the door of my room opened. Zev stood in the frame. No jacket. Dark shirt. A cut above his left eyebrow bleeding in a clean, narrow line that he hadn't addressed and apparently did not intend to. He looked at me with those still, dark eyes and conducted a swift, thorough visual assessment, the chair, the table, the dry cleaning, me, and something in his jaw loosened by a degree. "Are you hurt?" he said. "No." He crossed the room in 4 steps, took my face in both hands, and looked at me with a focus so complete it obliterated everything else in the room. His hands were warm, and one of them had dried blood on the knuckle, and he was looking at me the way you look at something you came a very long distance to find. "Gideon refused to pay," I said. "I know." His thumbs moved, once, across my cheekbones. "He's going to regret that." Then he stepped back, took my hand, and led me out of the room and through a corridor that I didn't look at carefully because there were things in it I understood, instinctively, that I didn't need to see. Outside, the night air hit me like a door opening, warm and salt-edged and enormous, after the small room and the high window and the folding chair. Marco was at the curb with the car running. I got in and Zev got in beside me and the door closed and we pulled away into the dark and I sat with my hands in my lap and felt the city rebuilding itself around me through the window, light by light, and did not speak for a long time. Eventually I said, "You came." He didn't look at me. He was watching the road, that particular stillness of his intact despite the cut, the blood, whatever had happened in the corridors of that building. "Did you think I wouldn't?" he said. I didn't answer. Because the honest answer was that I hadn't known, until the door opened and he was standing in it, how completely I had trusted that he would. How long I'd been sitting in that chair not calculating escape routes, but simply waiting for him, specifically, with a certainty that had arrived quietly and taken up permanent residence somewhere beneath my sternum. Gideon had refused to pay. Zev had come through fire. The city moved past the windows and I said nothing else, and neither did he, and the silence between us was not empty. It had never been empty. Neutral ground, it turned out, was a hotel. Zev chose it, a place on the water, the kind of establishment that rented its top floors by the week to people who required discretion as a structural feature rather than a courtesy. He booked a suite on the 14th floor with a terrace that faced the bay, and he told me the meeting was in 2 days, and he told me what he intended, and he asked me, with the directness that had become the thing I trusted most about him, whether I was willing to be in the room. I said yes before he finished the question. Gideon arrived at 7 in the evening, which meant he deliberated about the time, late enough to suggest he'd had to rearrange a full day, early enough that it wasn't yet dark, because Gideon understood optics down to the quality of available light. He came with one other person, a man I recognized as his senior partner, which was a tell. He'd framed this, internally, as a negotiation, which meant he'd decided there was still something here that could be structured to his advantage. He arrived expecting a table. Terms. A legible transaction. He did not expect me to open the door. The pause when he saw me was brief, a quarter second, a single recalibration, and then his face composed itself back into that familiar professional neutrality, and he said, "Lux," in the tone he used for minor surprises. "Not my name is warmth. My name is acknowledgement." Filing the variable. "Gideon," I said. I stepped back. "Come in." Zev was standing at the terrace doors when they entered, the bay behind him going gold in the last of the evening light. He didn't move from the window. He didn't extend a hand. He looked at Gideon with the expression of a man who had already determined the outcome and was here only as a formality, which I understood was itself a weapon, the removal of uncertainty from the room. The refusal to perform the social rituals that create the illusion of equality between parties. Gideon's partner introduced himself. Zev didn't respond to the introduction. His eyes stayed on Gideon. "You refuse to pay," Zev said. No preamble. No gesture toward the chairs arranged around the low table with the water and the glasses that nobody would touch. Gideon settled into the room the way he settled into courtrooms, finding the center of gravity, orienting toward it. "I don't negotiate with criminal instruments," he said. "My wife was taken by people operating in your ecosystem." The appropriate response was law enforcement, which I initiated. "Law enforcement found nothing," Zev said. "Because you gave them nothing. You filed a report at 11:15 that was designed to be unfollowable. You created a paper trail that showed compliance without creating one that showed effort." He tilted his head slightly. "You let her sit in that room for 14 hours because the alternative was admitting, publicly, that you were the kind of man whose enemies take his wife." The room was very quiet. Gideon's expression didn't break, but something behind it did, a small, structural thing, like a hairline crack in concrete that changes nothing about the load-bearing capacity until it does. "This is a performance," he said. He turned to me briefly. "You understand this is a performance." He manufactured a crisis to position himself as the resolution. "Did he take me?" I said. A pause. "His world did." "That's not what I asked." Gideon looked at me for a moment with the expression of a man encountering unexpected resistance from something he'd classified as stable. Then he turned back to Zev. "What do you want?" "Specifically." The Meridian injunction lifted, the holding companies unfrozen. "Say the number. Say the terms." "That's why we're here. Let's not dress it in anything else." Zev moved, finally, away from the window, into the room, unhurried as always, coming to stand at the end of the table between them without sitting. "I want the injunction lifted, yes," he said. "I want the Meridian parcels released from the legal freeze by close of business Friday. I want a written withdrawal from your client's development group citing irreconcilable planning conflicts." He paused. "And I want you to tell her the truth about the offshore account." Gideon went very still. "The account in her name," Zev said, conversationally. "The one your firm opened using her signature on documents she signed as part of a broader filing in 2021, a signature she gave without understanding what it was attached to. The account that currently holds assets that, if a prosecutor examined them, would constitute evidence of financial structuring." He looked at Gideon with something that was almost academic in its detachment. "You built her a cage and then put a lock on it that was also a trap. I want you to explain that to her. In this room. Now." Gideon's partner touched his arm, a lawyer's reflexive intervention, the instinct to prevent a client from speaking when speech becomes liability. Gideon shook him off. A small gesture, but the first uncontrolled one I'd seen from him in 4 years. "It was asset protection," he said. To me, not to Zev. As though the room had narrowed to just the two of us and he'd decided, in the calculation of the moment, that I was the audience worth persuading. "The account was structured to protect our assets from litigation exposure. Your name was the cleanest vehicle. You had no professional liabilities, no litigation history. It was practical. It was my name," I said. "It was a legal instrument. It was my name," I said again, quietly. "On documents I didn't understand, attached to assets I didn't know existed, creating exposure I didn't consent to." I looked at my husband, this man I had dressed beside for 4 years, whose coffee I had watched go cold, whose silences I had learned like a second language. "You used me as a vehicle. From the beginning. Not a wife. Not even an asset. A vehicle. You were provided for," he said, and the sincerity in it was the most revealing thing he'd ever said to me, the genuine, undefended belief that provision was the whole of it, that the material completeness of my life negated any claim I might make about its other dimensions. He believed it. That was the thing I finally, fully understood in this room on the 14th floor with the bay going dark behind Zev's shoulder. Gideon had never been cruel in the way of men who know they're being cruel. He'd been cruel in the more total way, The way of men who've built a coherent internal logic in which cruelty doesn't appear anywhere in the architecture because it's been classified as something else entirely. Management. Protection. Provision. I felt something release in my chest. Not dramatically, not the movie version of a woman finally breaking free, no surge of fury, no tears. Just a quiet, cellular release, the way a hand opens when it's been holding something too long and the muscles simply stop. I want a divorce, I said. I want the offshore account dissolved and the assets documented and transferred out of my name by the same attorney who put them there. I want it completed before any Meridian settlement is signed. I looked at Gideon's partner. I assume you can advise him on the terms. The partner looked at Gideon. Gideon looked at me with the expression of a man encountering, for the first time, a variable he had not modeled. It lasted 5 seconds, the longest I had ever watched his composure work to hold itself together. Then he straightened his jacket. "I'll have my attorney contact you," he said. He walked to the door. His partner followed. Gideon paused with his hand on the frame, the last performance, the final calibration of exit, and turned back once. He didn't look at Zev. He looked at me. And for one unguarded moment, beneath the neutrality and the control and the architecture of a man who had built his entire life on the management of outcomes, I saw something that might, in another life and another man, have been grief. Then it was gone. The door closed with its familiar soft, definitive click. I stood in the quiet room and breathed. Behind me, Zev said nothing. He moved to the terrace doors and opened them, and the night air came in off the bay, warm and salt-edged and real, and I stood in it for a long moment before I turned around. He was watching me with those still, dark eyes. "You knew about the account for 2 years," I said. "Yes. You could have told me the first day." "Yes," he said. "I could have." I looked at him. "Why didn't you?" He was quiet for a moment. "Because you needed to see it yourself." In a room. From him. He held my gaze steadily. "Told by me, it was a weapon. Seen by you, it was the truth." I thought about that. Outside, the bay moved in the dark, light scattered across it in pieces. He was right. I hated that he was right, and I was grateful for it, and both of those things were true at once, which was, I was learning, the grammar of existing in Zev Valerius's world. Nothing was simple. Everything was true. "What happens now?" I said. He looked at me across the room. "That depends entirely on you." The divorce papers arrived on a Thursday, which felt right. Not a Tuesday. Tuesdays belonged to Gideon's precision, his chosen days for dismantling. Thursday was mine now, by default, by the small private act of deciding that certain days could be reclaimed. The envelope sat on the kitchen island in the house that had always been his and never been mine, and I made coffee I actually drank, standing up. Without the performance of a table setting or a linen napkin, or the careful choreography of a marriage that had been, from its foundations, a legal instrument dressed in the language of a life. I signed where the flags indicated. All of them. Didn't read every clause the way Gideon would have, and had advised me to, through his attorney, in the careful language of a man who still believed I was a variable he could influence through procedural intimidation. I'd had my own attorney for 3 weeks by then. A woman named Carla who wore flat shoes and spoke in complete sentences and looked at the offshore account documentation with an expression of quiet professional fury that I found, unexpectedly, comforting. The account was being dissolved. The assets documented, transferred, extracted from my name with the same quiet efficiency with which they'd been placed there. Carla had described the process as surgical. I had thought about that word for days afterward, how Gideon had always used surgery as a metaphor for precision, for clean outcomes. How it felt, now, to have the surgery performed on the thing he'd built rather than on me. I signed the last page. Initialed the corner. Put the pen down. The house was very quiet around me. All the lights were off except the kitchen, which was how I'd been keeping it since the hotel, the minimum necessary illumination. Nothing blazing, nothing performed. I'd been sleeping on my side of the bed and then, after the first week, in the middle of it. which was a small thing that felt enormous every morning when I woke up and registered the space and didn't immediately contract into the habitual dimensions of a woman trying to take up less room. I put the papers in the return envelope, sealed it, set it by the door. Then I went upstairs and opened the nightstand drawer and took out the black box. The estate where the gala had been held belonged to a man who rented it for private events. I'd found that out, somewhere in the weeks of paperwork and attorney calls and the slow, unglamorous machinery of ending a marriage. It was available. Zev had arranged it without my asking, which I'd understood not as presumption but as attention, the specific attention of a man who tracked what mattered to the people he'd decided to keep, and acted on it quietly, without theater. I arrived in the late afternoon, before any caterers or staff, while the light was still doing that particular Miami thing, golden and slightly unreal, the kind of light that makes everything look like a memory even while you're standing in it. The gate was open. The grounds were empty. The pool stretched out exactly as I remembered, black and glassy, lit from below, the water moving in its slow, private rhythm. I stood at the edge where I'd stood before. Same stone beneath my feet. Same water. Different woman, or the same woman with the scaffolding finally removed. I hadn't decided which framing was truer and suspected both were, in the way that most true things are multiple. I thought about the gin glass. The 3 hours of being invisible. The way Gideon's back had stayed turned and turned and turned until the turning became the whole of the marriage. A man perpetually facing away from something he'd acquired and stopped needing to look at. I thought about walking across this terrace in 4-inch heels with a hammering pulse and a reckless, jagged impulse that I'd called manipulation at the time and now understood had been something more desperate and more honest than that, a woman reaching, in the only direction available, for proof that she still existed. I reached into my bag and took out the black box. Opened it one last time. The bracelet sat in its velvet, that small silver bird with its wings open, caught in permanent mid-decision. I put it on. Properly this time, not in secret, not in a locked room, not to be taken off before anyone saw. I fastened the clasp and held my wrist up in the afternoon light and looked at the bird and felt, for a moment, the full weight of the sequence it had traveled, nightstand drawer, coat pocket, bathroom counter, always hidden. Always the thing I reached for and retreated from. Done with that now. I heard footsteps on the stone behind me. Zev came to stand beside me at the pool's edge, his shoulder near mine, his eyes on the water. He'd come from somewhere. He was always coming from somewhere, always arriving in the aftermath of something the rest of the world hadn't seen. The cut above his eyebrow long healed now to a thin silver line that he'd probably carry forever. He looked at the pool, then at me, then at the bracelet on my wrist. He said nothing, which was, I'd learned, his version of saying everything. I signed the papers this morning, I said. I know. Carla called you? Carla called Marco. Marco told me. He looked back at the water. How do you feel? I considered the question honestly, the way I'd been practicing, not the managed version, not the composed version designed to present a particular face to a particular room, but the actual answer, taken from wherever it actually lived. Like something ended, I said. And like that's not the same as something being lost. He was quiet for a moment. Then, no, it's not. The water moved below us, lit from beneath, that deep and patient black. I thought about what I'd said at the beginning. The water is black and deep, and how I'd meant it as provocation, as theater, as a line delivered to an audience of one across a crowded terrace. How it had been, without my knowing it, also simply true. How the deep end was always where I'd been heading, had been heading long before this pool, long before this man, and the only variable was whether I'd finally stop pretending I wanted the shallow. I'm not going back, I said. Not to him specifically. To the pool, to the air, to the version of myself that had spent 4 years negotiating with a cage. I know, Zev said. And I'm not, I paused. Found the words. I'm not trading one arrangement for another. I'm not becoming a different version of managed. I turned to look at him. I need you to understand that. Whatever this is, whatever comes next, I'm not a prize. I'm not a trophy, and I'm not a queen, and I'm not a bird in any cage, silver or otherwise. I'm a person who is done being curated. He met my eyes. The stillness in him was complete, that particular quality that had frightened me at first, and now felt like the most honest thing in my life. A man who didn't perform, didn't manage, didn't dress his intentions in the language of protection while building traps. He was what he was. The blood beneath the glamour was real, and the glamour was real, and so was this, whatever this was, standing at the edge of a pool in the gold afternoon light with the city humming its indifferent hum around us. I understand, he said. Do you? Yes. He held my gaze. I came through a building for you. I didn't do that for a prize. A pause, brief and undefended. I did it because you sent me a message when you didn't have to. Because you chose it. Every time, the terrace, the warehouse, the restaurant, the hotel room, you chose. He looked back at the water. I don't want anything from you that isn't chosen. I stood with that for a long moment. The afternoon light moved across the pool in slow gold sheets. Somewhere beyond the estate walls, the city continued, courts and courtrooms and tabloids and meridian parcels, and the whole complicated machinery of powerful men conducting their business of power. Gideon would survive it. He would find another asset, build another structure, curate another life in another woman's name without ever once examining the architecture. That was the thing about men like him. They were self-renewing. But I was not in that machinery anymore. I reached down and slipped my shoes off. Set them on the stone beside me. I felt the warm edge of the pool beneath my bare feet, the specific temperature of marble that has been in sun all day. I looked at Zev. I'm going in. He looked at me, that slow, thorough look that took in everything and rushed nothing. Then he reached up and undid his collar button, shrugged his jacket off and set it on the stone. I know, he said. This time, when I entered the water, it wasn't a game. It wasn't a provocation or a performance or a desperate reach for proof of existence. It was simply a woman in a pool on a Thursday evening, the water black and cool and holding her completely, the city gold above the walls. A man entering the water beside her without being asked, because he'd already decided, and she'd already decided, and the deciding, finally, was entirely their own. I floated on my back and looked up at the sky, that particular shade of early evening blue that exists for approximately 12 minutes before it deepens into something else. The bird on my wrist caught the last of the light. I didn't let go of it.